For more than 60 years, the world has known Paul McCartney and George Harrison as two-fifths of the greatest band that ever existed. But long before the screaming crowds and the platinum records, they were just two schoolboys from Liverpool who found each other on a bus. Their story is one of the deepest and most complicated friendships in music history, full of mentorship, rivalry, silence, and in the end, a kind of love that outlasted everything, including death itself. Paul McCartney and George Harrison first crossed paths in 1954 at the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys. Paul was a year ahead of George, already known among classmates as sharp, confident, and musical. George was younger and quieter, a boy who later admitted school itself made him miserable. They didn't become friends over lessons or lunchtime games. They became friends on the bus. Both boys rode the same route into town, and it was there, away from teachers and uniforms, that they discovered a shared obsession. The skiffle craze sweeping post-war Britain, and behind it, the electric new sound coming out of America. George would later describe hearing Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel drifting from a house as a moment that changed the direction of his life. Paul, whose father had led a jazz band in the 1920s, already had music running through his household, and he recognized in George something rare: total, obsessive dedication. By the time George was a young teenager, he had already formed a small skiffle group with his brother. Paul, meanwhile, had joined John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen. When the group needed another guitarist, it was Paul who thought of George. Lennon wasn't convinced at first. George seemed too young. But according to Beatles historians, when George was finally given a chance to prove himself, he won John over with his playing. And by early 1958, the three future Beatles had found each other. For Paul, who had lost his mother to cancer when he was 14, that early friendship group offered something steadying. For George, being accepted by older, more experienced musicians was validation he badly wanted. Those years built the foundation of a bond that Paul, decades later, would describe with real tenderness, recalling hitchhiking around the country with George before any of them had heard of fame, and calling the friendship that grew from it something that ran very deep. There was also a practical side to that early bond that shaped the rest of their lives. Paul was the one who vouched for George to John again and again when Lennon dismissed him as too young to take seriously. It meant that from the very start of the Beatles story, George owed part of his place in the band to Paul's insistence, a debt of gratitude that would sit alongside, and sometimes clash with, the resentment George felt in later years about being treated as the group's junior partner. In interviews, George himself would later reflect on how strange it was to grow from the little kid on the bus into someone whose guitar work and songwriting helped define an era, all while still being seen, in some ways, through the lens of that early dynamic. By the time the Beatles were playing the clubs of Hamburg and Liverpool in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the three of them, along with Stuart Sutcliffe and later Pete Best, before Ringo Starr joined in 1962, had become inseparable, sharing cramped lodgings, brutal performance schedules, and the kind of exhausting apprenticeship that forged both their sound and their loyalty to one another. Paul and George, in particular, spent long stretches of those years trading guitar techniques, working out harmonies, and absorbing whatever records they could get their hands on. It was a period neither man would ever describe as easy, but both would later look back on it as formative in ways that had little to do with fame, because at that point, fame wasn't guaranteed at all. As Beatlemania swept the world in the early 1960s, the dynamic between Paul and George began to shift. Paul had increasingly become the band's most driven creative force, the one pushing hardest in the studio, chasing new arrangements, obsessing over details. That drive helped produce some of the most ambitious music of the era. It also, for George, started to feel suffocating. Nowhere was that more visible than during the making of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967, a record largely shaped by Paul's vision. George contributed one song to the album, steeped in the Indian classical music and spirituality he'd been immersing himself in. It was deeply personal to him. To the rest of the band, it was simply another track on a concept album. The gap between what music meant to Paul and what it meant to George was widening. That gap became even clearer during the Beatles' trip to India in 1968. For George, meditation wasn't a phase. It was becoming central to how he saw his life. Paul was more skeptical, treating the trip with a lighter touch that George didn't always appreciate. As the 60s wore on, George found himself increasingly frustrated that his songwriting was treated as secondary to the Lennon-McCartney partnership, even as his own catalog of unreleased material kept growing. Structurally, the Beatles' business had always been built around Lennon and McCartney as the primary songwriting engine, with publishing and album space allotted accordingly. That arrangement made sense in the early years, when George was still finding his footing as a writer. But by 1968 and 1969, George was producing songs of real depth and craft, tracks that, by most accounts from people close to the band, were sometimes tried in session and then set aside in favor of another Lennon-McCartney composition. George rarely complained about it loudly in public at the time, but those close to him have said the frustration built steadily, year after year, until it became one of the clearest fault lines running through the group. Paul, for his part, has acknowledged in later interviews that he didn't fully appreciate what George was capable of until relatively late in the band's run, an admission that came easier decades after the fact than it likely would have in the tension of the studio itself. By January 1969, tensions inside the band had become impossible to ignore. The filmed rehearsals for what became Let It Be captured in real time, a band fraying at the edges, Paul often directing the others in the studio, and George growing visibly worn down by it. On January 10th, George walked out of a rehearsal entirely, later saying it had become an unhealthy, unhappy place for him to be. The other Beatles talked him into returning less than 2 weeks later, but something had changed for good. That same year, in a conversation later recounted by writer Anthony Fawcett and published in Barry Miles' authorized biography of McCartney, Paul told John Lennon that their songs had always been better than George's, but that this year George's had become just as strong. It was meant in part as praise. George didn't take it that way. He pushed back on the idea that his writing had suddenly improved, insisting he'd simply been holding songs back for years, no longer worried whether the others approved. It's a small exchange, but it captures something real about where the two men stood with each other by the end of the decade. Respect tangled up with resentment. If 1969 exposed the cracks in the band, it also gave George Harrison his overdue moment. When the Beatles recorded Abbey Road that year, it was George who delivered two of the album's most enduring songs, Here Comes the Sun and Something. John Lennon himself would later call Something the best track on the record. For George, it was proof, finally, that he belonged at the center of the band's sound rather than its edges. For Paul, it was a sign that the balance between them had shifted. The Beatles broke up officially the following year. George moved quickly, releasing the sprawling triple album All Things Must Pass in late 1970, a record that stunned critics with how much George Harrison had apparently been holding back. Reviewers who had spent a decade treating him as the Beatles' third songwriter suddenly had to reckon with an artist who had clearly been sitting on years of unreleased material, and the album's commercial success gave George a sense of validation that had eluded him for most of the previous decade. Paul, meanwhile, began his own solo path with the stripped-down album McCartney, recorded largely on his own at home, and later formed the band Wings, which would go on to have substantial commercial success of its own through the 1970s. Through that decade, contact between Paul and George was sporadic and not always warm. George would say in interviews that he found Paul overpowering to work with, even while acknowledging their shared history and his enormous respect for Paul's musicianship. In August 1971, George helped organize the star-studded concert for Bangladesh at Madison Square Garden, one of the first major benefit concerts in rock history, bringing together artists like Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and Ringo Starr. Paul did not take part. By most accounts, he had reservations about the logistics and the optics of a Beatles reunion at that particular moment, given how raw the breakup still was. It was a decision that, for a time, only widened the emotional distance between the two men, even as George's project went on to raise significant money for humanitarian relief and helped establish the modern template for the celebrity benefit concert. By the early 1990s, time had softened some of what had built up between them. In 1994, George, Paul, and Ringo Starr reunited in the studio to work on unfinished John Lennon demos, a project the press quickly nicknamed the Threedles. George arrived with firm opinions about how the session should run, insisting the band bring in producer Jeff Lynne rather than trying to work it out among themselves. A caution that Paul later admitted probably saved the sessions from falling apart under old tensions. The work produced two new Beatles songs, Free as a Bird and Real Love, built from Lennon's original demos. Even then, the two men didn't always agree on how the songs should sound, but they finished the work, and in doing so, built a small bridge back to each other. It was around this time that Paul also began, more publicly than before, to acknowledge how much he'd underestimated George as a songwriter in the Beatles' early years, describing him as someone who came into his own as a writer later than John or Paul had, and then wrote some of the greatest songs of his generation. The Beatles sessions were part of a larger project, the anthology documentary series and accompanying albums, which brought the three surviving Beatles together not just musically, but for hours of joint interviews about their shared history. Sitting across from each other decades after the breakup, Paul and George revisited old arguments with a kind of hard-won perspective that hadn't been possible in the heat of 1969. Neither man pretended the tensions of the past hadn't been real, but both seemed willing, by the mid-1990s, to hold those tensions alongside genuine affection rather than letting one erase the other. It was during this same stretch that George, in his typically understated way, would still needle Paul in interviews about his tendency to want control in the studio, even as the two of them worked closely together on finishing his old friend's music. George's health began to decline sharply in the late 1990s. He was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1997, and in the years that followed he battled further illness, including a violent knife attack at his home in 1999 that left him physically shaken. Cancer eventually spread to his lungs and brain. Through it, Paul stayed close, visiting when he could as George's condition worsened. In a 2008 interview, Paul described one of the last times he saw George, in a New York hospital before George moved to Los Angeles in his final weeks. The two of them, Paul said, spent hours together joking about small, ordinary things, the kind of nonsense only two people who'd known each other since childhood could find funny. At one point they held hands, something Paul noted that would have felt almost impossible for two Liverpool lads in their 20s to do, without embarrassment. He remembered it feeling almost like a dream. George, he said, had become like a little brother to him, a bond built over more than 4 decades. George Harrison died on November 29, 2001, at the age of 58, after years of treatment for throat and lung cancer that had ultimately spread to his brain. In keeping with his Hindu beliefs, his ashes were scattered in the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in India, a final expression of the spiritual devotion that had shaped so much of his life since the Beatles' trip to India more than 3 decades earlier. The day after his death, Paul spoke to reporters outside his home, visibly shaken, calling George a lovely man with a wonderful sense of humor, and a very brave man who would be remembered as great in his own right. He went further in describing what George meant to him personally, telling reporters that George had essentially been like a baby brother to him, a phrase Paul would return to again in later interviews when reflecting on the friendship. Ringo Starr, the band's other surviving member, echoed the sentiment publicly, saying the world would miss George for his warmth, his music, and his sense of humor. Tributes poured in from musicians across genres, and in New York, fans gathered before dawn at Strawberry Fields, the section of Central Park already dedicated to John Lennon, to mourn George as well, a reminder of how tightly bound the 4 Beatles remained in the public imagination, even decades after they'd stopped playing together. In the years since, Paul has found quiet, personal ways to keep George close. George had once given him a fir tree as a gift, knowing Paul would plant it near the gate of his home. Paul has spoken since about how every time he passes that tree, he still looks up and says, "Hi, George," as if some part of his old friend is still there growing. That instinct to keep George present in ordinary, everyday life says something about how Paul has processed the loss. Rather than only speaking about George in grand public terms, as a genius guitarist, a groundbreaking solo artist, a founding member of the most famous band in history, Paul has often gravitated towards small, private memories. A joke shared in a hospital room, a tree by a gate, the sound of a school bus. Those are the details of an ordinary friendship, not just a legendary one. And it's telling that after everything, they're the ones Paul chooses to hold on to. The friendship between Paul McCartney and George Harrison was never simple. It was built on a school bus, tested by fame, strained by ego and ambition, and nearly severed more than once. But it survived through a decade of global stardom, through a bitter breakup, through years of distance, and finally through George's illness and death. What's left isn't a tidy story of two rock stars who never fought. It's something more honest. Two men who grew up together, pushed each other, hurt each other, forgave each other, and in the end, never really stopped being brothers. What's your favorite George Harrison song? And do you think Paul was right to call him one of the greatest songwriters of his generation? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from music history.